The second part of Kathy's question then.
Yep.
So why doesn't God do that for all souls that incarnate? This very intervention would imply that there is something special about you. If he can do it for one, why not for all? It would change the world if he, she were to do it.
I can't agree with a lot of these statements.
So if I just
finish them and we go back over.
This very thing seems inconsistent. How do you reconcile this?
Yeah, so let's go back over it. I feel that we need to discuss things as they arise, as I've talked about with you, because I don't like to see untruth presented without having to go back over.
Okay, so why does God not remove the errors of everyone's parents when they incarnate?
There are a lot of reasons why God does not do it. Firstly, many of the persons, once God removed it, would not choose to accept God's love anyway, just like Amon and a man didn't choose to accept God's love. So there's no guarantee that if you remove the sin of a person, that they will actually accept God's love anyway. And that is a personal choice and decision. Mm-hmm. Secondly, God is economical. God doesn't do anything that God doesn't need to do. So once one person had taught the truth to the world, there's no need for another to do it. There's no need, when I say another, there's no need for another to be put through the same process that I had to go through myself. Mm-hmm. And even though God did that for me, my life in the first century was very, very difficult, because being placed in that position as a child, I was very much opposed to the general children of the day. Mm. And that caused actually those children to have quite severe attacks towards me. And those attacks continued from childhood right the way through to my death. Mm-hmm. So the average person on earth, God is actually visiting upon the person in some ways. Mm-hmm. The fact that he is giving them the opportunity to be in a perfect state means they are very, very different from everyone else in society. Mm. And if God did that to not to all, but just to one mm-hmm. person or another person, there is the high likelihood that person would have the same experience that we had, or I had, in the first century, and that is have a very, very traumatic life. Now, God doesn't create any trauma or no trauma and then create it purposefully. Mm. God only does these things for reasons. So there's no point in another person going through the same trauma I had to experience in the first century in order to bring God's love to earth.
However, we are all aiming for that, aren't we, now, to remove the sins of our parents that we've inherited and to receive God's love. I'm not talking
about that trauma, though.
You're talking about the from birth experience of being completely out of harmony.
I was ostracised, ridiculed, and generally condemned and violently treated most of my life, and pretty much all my life in the first century.
Sorry, I'm just trying to specify. And that was largely because you didn't have the sin that others around you had, so you were immediately from birth in opposition
and therefore exposed to their potential violence.
Yeah. Whereas all of us now doing it, we are adults, we're working through things, we are...
And that was almost not a choice of mine.
Yeah.
He knew that I'd make the choice to do it, but God placed me in this position where he knew that I'd be able to handle those particular issues. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't that I had made that intellectual choice right at the time of birth when God cleared away the Adamic sin, if you could call it that, or the sin of a man and a man, which was really the sin of walking away from God and having your worth destroyed as a result.
Yeah.
And so not all things needed to be removed from me. It was only that thing that needed to be removed in order for me to take these actions.
Yeah.
So firstly, I wouldn't, if it was just a few people, then I would say that they would have an extreme amount of problems in their life, just like I did in the first century, unless they're doing it like we are currently doing it. And even then, we're getting large amounts of attack.
Yeah.
Most people would not be able to cope with even a small amount of attack that we receive, even in our current life, let alone the life that we had then.
Yeah.
And so God is loving in the way that God has prepared humankind and also presented God's truth to humankind and presented the option of receiving God's love to humankind. The other thing is that there are a number of other reasons, and we could go on this subject for quite a few days actually, because there are a lot of reasons, but I'm just trying to give a few basic reasons of why God wouldn't do it.
I can think of another very significant one that we've talked about recently.
Sure.
And that is about how really the visitation of a parent's sin upon their children is one of the most powerful feedback mechanisms for a person to come to recognise their sin. And many parents, even who don't have an interest in God, have experienced that where they realise, wow, I've done something to my child, or I can see something in my child that came from me that's now causing them pain. I need to look at myself. And really, if God removed everyone's, it would be like removing the consequences of people's sinful actions, would it not?
Yeah, see, God only removed the consequences of the parental actions in my part. I still had the choice to sin or not sin, and I took the choice to not sin all through my life. But I could have easily sinned, just like Ammon and Aman did. But God knew that my desire for God was strong enough to pull me through, and also to not desire to sin. What I'm suggesting is that if God just took away the full sin of mankind without their choice being engaged, then obviously God would be breaking God's own laws. And that obviously God will not do. So humankind's sin is a direct result of their own choices. And so God only removed from me the choice that Adam and Eve, or Ammon and Aman, made. He didn't remove the other choices, the choices that I could have possibly made in sinning. And the problem with removing humanity's sin en masse without there being an understanding of how sin can be removed, and I had to personally learn how sin could be removed in order to help people remove it. And if that learning had not occurred, then obviously you're removing the effects of something without actually touching or understanding the causes of such things. And God doesn't do that either. So there are literally hundreds and hundreds of reasons why God can't do what Kathy is suggesting God should probably do. Also, and I need to emphasise this, in removing the Adamic sin, or the sin from Ammon and Aman, I was then exposed to the potential of huge amounts of violence and ridicule that the average person in the first century was not exposed to. And so, you know, that in itself, there were pros and cons of what was done, I must say. And
for you personally?
For me personally,
yes.
Yes. Yeah. Now, obviously, I don't see it as that anymore. You know, when I say anymore, I don't see there being any negative thing about what God has done. But you have to be prepared to experience quite a lot of pain if you want to go through that process.
Because you weren't without pain just because these...
Definitely not. Yeah. And obviously my ability to handle pain was different to other people's as a result of my not living in fear. But that only occurred once I become at one with God. Before then, of course, I had pain and fear associated with pain, and I dealt with those particular emotions as I grew. And there were many painful experiences in my life in the first century. Yeah. So it's important for people to understand that while it may seem that I had some kind of advantage, in the end there was also disadvantages associated with being in the position I was in. And so God did what God needed to do in order to allow a person to be able to receive God's love, and God foreknew that person would desire God's love, and so God at that time offered God's love again, and I embraced it, which I could have chosen not to do, since I had free will.
And I suppose I sort of see it as, a lot of people say, oh, you were special, God did that for you. For me, I feel like, no, God did that for all of humanity.
Correct. It
all
wasn't
of humanity.
For me.
No, not. And as you've pointed out, it didn't necessarily bring you a trouble-free life. In fact, quite the opposite.
Quite the opposite.
But it was something that happened between God and our soul,
Yes.
which was to create an opportunity for all of humanity, and not just in the time that we lived, but forever
afterwards, yeah.
And so to me, it's not about a single person. It's about a very, very special gift that God wanted to give to all of humanity.
Yeah, it's a gift to all of humanity that God gave the opportunity to one person to who God foreknew would actually take the opportunity, and God helped that one person to take the opportunity, and that is a gift to humanity.
Because it became a demonstration, as you talk about all the time, of a potential for everyone.
Yeah, it demonstrated the reality, so people could have faith that they could do it, and they could do it in a much less painful manner than I experienced.
Yeah.
Because they would have less attack, or less, potentially less attack than what I experienced. And the majority of people who have become at one with God, particularly those in the spirit world, have received very little, if any, attack. Actually.
Yeah.
So, they've had a much more gentle experience with regard to the process than I had in the first century. And that I'm having now because of the I suppose you could say, the position that I've been placed in this time around as well, and all the 14 have been placed in.
Yeah.
So the 14 who returned are experiencing the same kind of trauma that I have experienced, or have been experiencing, both in the first century and in this life. And many of them are not choosing at this stage to embrace that process, which is a process that has its difficulties, as anybody would know who is starting to follow the path properly.
And of course, in this time on earth, in this return, as we've returned to earth, you really are the only one out of the 14 of us who has really embraced the opportunity, the new opportunity that God and the 14 of us, or the 7 souls, we decided to try to create a new opportunity on earth for humanity. And you certainly have been the only one who has embraced that fully. And
but that being said, there are, again, reasons why that's the case. Firstly, I have a memory of my first century life and my first century embracing of the opportunities
on earth.
Whereas the others do not. They all generally embrace some divine truth on earth and divine love on earth, but the majority of them, all of them, became at one with God in the spirit world, and so I was the only person to do it on earth. So it's easier for me coming back to earth to retain some faith in the process that I can potentially do it
on earth,
while on earth. Whereas it's much more difficult for the rest of the 14 to retain that belief, if you like, or have some faith in that. So that there are even reasons there as to why. That being said, because I'm the first person, I'm the person that still gets attacked the most.
Well, and so this is what I was going to say. And also in this in this time, God has not removed that sin. So you're actually facing quite a trial in life without having this kind of
and on top of that, getting attacked and being at the forefront of the whole thing, you also get attacked the most. So so whatever advantages I had the first time around, I certainly don't have now. And in fact, there are quite a lot of disadvantages. But God knows me well enough to know that I desire God's love, and I desire to share God's truth more than I desire my own welfare. And as a result of that, God's pretty confident about my abilities even when I'm not. And I can't say that I am confident that we will achieve what we came to achieve at this stage, because, it's an experiment. It's not something that I foreknow myself. Only God foreknows what the outcome is going to be of this visit to Earth. And I feel quite strongly it will be my last visit to Earth, but only God foreknows what the outcome can be. So for myself and all the 14 who have returned. Because also each of us have our own, just as you did in the first century, God doesn't interfere with our free will choices. And so we each have free will decisions in front of us every single day that impact upon the success or failure of this experiment. Correct. Yeah. So obviously, Yeah, there's a lot more involved than just answering this for 10 minutes or something like that. But,
if we just
but
quickly...
hopefully we've given her, Kathy, some of the reasons why God can't do what she's suggesting, which include God would be breaking God's laws, God would be removing the effects of things from humanity rather than addressing the causes, which is against God's laws, and God won't do anything against God's own laws. The offer that God made to me in the first century had certain conditions imposed upon it that the majority of humanity probably wouldn't want.
and you certainly went through quite a bit.
Yes,
because
both
of it.
then and now. That the average person on this planet would never need to experience.
And also it wasn't about making you special, it was about God creating a special opportunity
for humanity.
There's just one thing that I think you may want to address, one of the statements. Kathy's saying that if God did this for everyone, it would change the world.
No. It won't change the world for a number of reasons. You know, obviously God could, but firstly God can't, because the soul of these individuals doesn't have the desire for God to do it. Now, in my first century life, I had this desire that I can remember ever since I can remember anything. So this desire became a part of was a part of myself. And obviously God created it as a part of me in a stronger way than any others, and I've got no explanation for that. But the reality is I cannot remember a time when I was not open towards God. And the reality is that's how God could actually clean the soul from the Adamic sin. If I did not have that soul-based openness, my soul would have prevented God from doing it. And God will not break God's own laws in order to do it. And the majority of humankind right now are in the condition where they do not want God to do it. So for God to do it en masse, to do it with everyone, which is really what would need to occur for all pain and suffering to cease, or all humanity would need to make the choice themselves to do it. And for God to do it, God would have to break so many of God's own laws that it's actually not going to be possible.
And if God then broke the laws, which form the very fabric of the universe,
what's going to happen then?
What's going to happen? And also, would God impact upon everyone's will? If God left everyone's will intact, then there's still the potentiality.
This is what I'm saying.
For the choice for sin. And so it wouldn't really, it's not a long-term solution.
No, it's not a long-term solution. Ammon and a man chose sin, even though they were perfect. So just because you're made perfect by someone else, it doesn't mean that you can't choose sin. So it's not a long-term solution. Mankind has to come to the point where they want to not sin anymore. And that is the long-term solution.
And if we think about that, when individuals within humanity reach the decision, the will-based, they develop their will enough to say, I no longer want to sin, then God does have a system in place where there is the removal of inherited sin, which is called repentance.
Exactly.
So it's actually
all in place right now.
Yeah.
And the majority of people aren't embracing it, of course.
Yeah.
But it is all in place right now. The gift was already given, 2,000 years ago it was given, and the gift is still the opportunity to remove sin from your heart. It exists right now. God can't do it while you oppose it. And Kathleen is a demonstration of that in some regards, because she's worked through some of this sin about abortion, and she's come to terms with some of the things she's doing. She's started the process of repentance, so she's starting the process, in fact, that all humankind will need to address at some point.
Yeah. And that's the long-term solution, isn't it?
That's the long-term solution.